Good morning. Thank you for viewing this legal lesson sponsored by the Law Office of Travell, Travis. Our firm specializes in the needs of pastors, entrepreneurs, creatives, and the community. We encourage you to please like, comment, share this video. Also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, as well as visit our website, travelltravis.com. Email us, travelltravis@gmail.com, or call us at area code 757-528-8529. As a disclaimer, videos are for educational advertising and not a substitute for consulting a licensed attorney in your state, nor do these videos create an attorney-client relationship. Last year, if I may, I published my first book entitled Don't Eat the Baby, The Characteristics of a Cannibalistic Church. In chapter 6, I discussed the polar bear and used that to speak about sex abuse, sexual assault, and harassment that takes place in the church. And I raised issues in terms of the need for churches to train and screen workers, to develop protocols and procedures for handling allegations, and ministries equipped to serve victims as well as the violators and their families of sexual assault, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. One of the things that I mentioned in that chapter, and I encourage you to go to www.don'teatthebaby.org to purchase your copy of the book and to read particular that chapter. But one of the things that I mentioned is the need to know the legal requirements in your state as it relates to reporting sexual abuse in your congregation, or known to you or to your ministers in your congregation. As of July 1st, Virginia has been added to the list that now requires ministers to report suspicions of abuse and neglect unless that church's doctrine requires otherwise. So while anyone may voluntarily report, ministers are now added to the list with doctors and teachers and nurses are mandatory to report any suspicion of abuse or neglect of children, or otherwise face a fine for failing to report it. This includes any suspicions of physical abuse or neglect, sexual abuse, emotional, mental abuse of someone under the age of 18. So even if it happened years ago, if the person is still under the age of 18, there is still a mandatory requirement, especially if that person, the victim, is a citizen of Virginia, as well as the alleged violator is a citizen of Virginia. The mandatory reporting doesn't necessarily initiate criminal charges or proceedings, but merely opens an inquiry or investigation to find out if further investigation, further charges, further actions are warranted. Reporting can be done anonymously or confidentially, or one can include their name and information, and there are some pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages of doing it anonymously or confidentially, which I will not get into at this moment. Note that the law, as of now, does not necessarily change any of the standing rules of confidential communications between clergy and members in regards to civil or criminal matters. So even though you might be required to report it in terms of initiating an investigation, there may be still some room not to have to testify in court if it gets to that point. So right now, we're not dealing with court testimony. We're largely dealing with who is required to report such incidents to the authorities. There are two exemptions to this law. The first is if it is known known that someone else has reported the suspicions or allegations to the authorities, then you don't have to do it again. But you want to make sure that is known, is confirmed. So exemption number one, you don't have to report something that has already been reported. But the second exemption is where the law says your doctrine prohibits the sharing or disclosing of any information between perhaps a minister and the member in counseling or in confessions, in some type of situation along those lines. Most notably, many are familiar with the practice in the Catholic Church of confessions, normally anonymous, and is a very sacred thing between the member, the congregation, and the priest to be able to share and to disclose. And so if that is a fundamental tenet of your doctrine, that confidentiality, counseling, and confession should be maintained, it needs to be documented in your discipline manual, in your bylaws, in your doctrine. It can't just be something that you say or do, but not have written documentation to support that is a fundamental tenet or belief or practice of the church. And so once again, if you look at the Catholic example, you're dealing with normally confidential, anonymous, and something that's long-term sacred. I even saw an article recently where the Pope reaffirmed that sacredness and confidentiality in the confession to the priest. So unless you're at that level or have documented, you want to make sure that there are some clear guidelines in that regard. How should one proceed with this new law? One, I think it's important for churches to have not just a training, but regular training as to who, what, when, where, and how to identify as well as to report allegations of abuse and neglect. Also clarifying who's covered and who's not covered by the law. In terms of, it says ministers, but in many churches, who are ministers? Are we talking about the pastor? Are we talking about elders? Are we talking about licensed ministers, evangelists, deacons, missionaries? In some churches, you have a youth pastor or youth minister who isn't necessarily licensed as a minister, but has the title of a youth minister. And so it's going to be very important that there's even some degree of clarification as to who is covered within the congregation. Also, some in your congregation may be bivocational and have roles outside of the church that may require disclosure. And then there may be certain professions like myself, the legal profession, where you're not allowed necessarily to disclose certain allegations or suspicions of abuse or neglect, depending on the source of that information. So it's going to be important to have that dialogue, have that conversation within your congregation. And then number three, if doctrine or your belief or practice requires confidential communication, make sure that is clearly documented in your doctrine book, discipline manual, bylaws, that it is a known policy of the sorts. I give you two hypotheticals, and the law does not speak to this specifically. It may be some things that will be hashed out over time in court. But for example, this summer, a lot of churches, you have Vacation Bible School. You have your regular children, but also maybe drawing children from the congregation. From the community, if you will. Not only that, your staff. You may have teen volunteers who aren't ministers, but are ministering. What happens if a child from the community discloses to that teen teacher or staff member some inappropriate behavior or conduct? Are they required to disclose it to the authorities? Are they required to disclose it to someone in charge? What if that person in charge isn't necessarily a minister, but in ministry? And so whether it's Vacation Bible School, whether it's children's church, whether it's the Sunday school class, maybe it's just a youth fellowship group, maybe it's the youth ministry at the church. Who's required to report to whom? Maybe if that person is not a minister, but in ministry, should they have some type of procedure? Who do I go to with this information? How do we vet this information? And who is ultimately responsible for reporting that information? As well as in terms of having protocols in place to say, if someone begins to disclose certain information, that you give them a warning, or that you give them some type of disclaimer that, hey, if you go further in telling this information to me, then I may have be obligated to report it to authorities. And so sometimes it's just good for your staff, your leadership team, your ministerial staff, to really be aware of those protocols of the church. Who goes where? Who do we tell? We don't want to tell everybody in the church, but somebody in the church needs to know who is that person in that scenario. Another perhaps hypothetical could be the consensual, if you will, statutory rape. And you say, well, statutory rape is not consensual. But just say, for instance, you have someone who's 15 and someone who's 18, maybe a sophomore in high school and a senior high school. Something happens maybe on the prom night. Technically, in many states, that would be construed as statutory rape, albeit consensual, non-forced, but because of the age, statutory rape. Perhaps one of the parties discloses, hey, this is what happens. I feel regret. I feel remorse. Maybe it's at the altar. Maybe it's in a private counseling, one-on-one session. Is there a duty to report that to the authorities? Person's under age 18. Technically, that's statutory rape. They told you this in confidence that, hey, maybe they slipped, they fell, they have regrets, they're struggling with something. And the question is, you want to remain confidential, you want them to maintain trust in you, but at the same time, by law, are you now required to disclose that to the authorities? So once again, I think those conversations need to be had in the church, especially with your ministry leaders and your ministers, because it may not always be the pastor. It may be the altar worker. It may be the youth leader. It may be the Sunday school teacher. It may be the choir director. It may be someone who is in leadership or respected, who may not necessarily have a title or a license, but may be the first ones who are confronted with this information. And the question is, what happens next? And the reason I raise that is because what happens if 9 months later there's some evidence of what happened, if you will, or parents find out and they're going ballistic, like, wait a minute, you knew this was going on, you knew this happened to my child, especially if somehow the pregnancy is terminated, or somehow the pregnancy is ended because of medical issues, and the parents now like, wait a minute, you knew this happened between this person and this person, you kept it a secret, and they will likely, perhaps in their anger and frustration, be the one that reports to the authorities that you didn't disclose it, that you didn't share it. And so you want to make sure that there is a conversation, that there are some policies, there's some procedures, that there are some trainings that takes place in your church regarding this particular matter. Once again, our law office is available to assist you. You may also want to contact Child Protective Services or someone in that field to conduct some type of training, seminar, or workshop in your church, in your leadership conference, in your pastoral conferences, training sessions, whether it's of your Reformation denomination, your local church, or just something that you sponsor. This may be a topic that needs to be covered so everyone is aware of the issue. I will also post on this site and in the comments section the publication from the Commonwealth of Virginia Child Protective Services that really lays out in detail some of the scenarios and questions that you may have. Always remember that ignorance of the law is never an excuse for violating the law. And so that's why we provide these legal lessons to make you aware of the law, so you're not blindsided, and that you can put the proper training protocols, procedures, documentation in place to handle these situations. Something also I will ask you to do as I get ready to conclude this legal lesson for today is in the comments section. Please post perhaps your policies, your protocols, or your procedures that your church may have, or your opinion about some of the scenarios that I've listed. Please don't get into specifics or specific examples, but I think it is good to hear kind of how other churches, how other ministries handle certain scenarios, the protocols, the procedures, the doctrines, so that others may learn from it. So once again, if you're watching this video and you have something that you can share, or you have an opinion or a thought, as well as we encourage you to like, share, and comment on all of our videos so that they can be a benefit to the larger audience, to the kingdom at large. So once again, we thank you for viewing this legal lesson sponsored by the Law Office of Travell Travis. We encourage you to like, share, and comment on these and other videos, as well as on our fan page. Once again, connect to us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn. Visit our website, travelltravis.com. Email us, travelltravis@gmail.com, or call us at area code 757-528-8529. We love to help you and your church. Once again, God bless you and have a great day.